Hi, thanks so much for joining our event today. It's going to be an exciting discussion. There's a lot to cover. My name is Megan Green. I'm a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and write a regular column with the Financial Times. And I'm really excited to be joined here by Commissioner Phil Hogan, who's the European Commissioner for Trade, and also by Bob Zoellick, who is the former president of the World Bank. He's the former Deputy Secretary of State and also the former U.S. trade rep. So some real experts on trade here. Just really quickly, a housekeeping issue. We would love for you to go ahead and submit questions, and there are a number of avenues for you to do that. First of all, you can email it to europe@ceip.org. You can also submit questions over the YouTube chat. And then finally, you can tweet questions to @Carnegie Endow using the hashtag #AskCarnegie so that we can pick it up and hopefully get your questions in front of these two experts. But first, I have a lot of questions for these two. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner Hogan and Bob Zoellick. I want to start off pretty broadly talking about the world trade system. And there seems like there's been a big shift in the consensus away from free trade. So for Commissioner Hogan, first, I wanted to ask, what have we learned about the benefits and downsides, the winners and losers of free trade, and how should that inform our trade policy going forward?
Thank you very much, Megan, and I'm glad to be part of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace invitation here today. So glad to be joined as well on the panel by Bob Zoellick, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts as well. There's no doubt that this is a very opportune moment to talk about trade and changing global dynamics. And at this moment in our economic history, there are many moving parts. First of all, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which is, of course, disrupting the global economy. Different nations and different regions are responding in various ways. Secondly, we have something called a presidential election, I think, going on in the United States on the 3rd of November. That's having an impact. Thirdly, we have the crisis in the WTO, which is the global referee for the rules and the disciplines around trade. And that's in crisis and needs to have a new and effective direction, new and effective Director General. And fourthly, I would say that there's a trend and a greater trend now evident for economic nationalism, protectionism, and this, of course, means political choices have to be made about whether you're looking inwards or outwards. So all these factors have to come, have to be kept in mind when we imagine what the next global trade system will look like.
Great, thank you. You're right, all these factors need to come into it. Bob, what do you think about the world trade system? Is this free trade consensus dead, or can we claw it back?
Well, I noticed you focused on free trade consensus, and maybe it's a different view of history, but I don't think there's ever been a free trade consensus. I think for people who wanted to focus on open markets, that it's always been an uphill challenge. The forces that try to connect with local interests have always been very, very strong. So I guess I'd give three thoughts to start. One, the trade system is always dynamic. So even before COVID-19, you were seeing changes. So for example, the manufacturing trade from 2008 tended to be slowing down compared to GDP growth, but services trade was growing quite strongly, about 60% faster. You also had changes in the regional context, sometimes concentration in certain industries, East Asia obviously being some of the most important in that, and some of that reflecting changes within China, increased demand, internal supply chains, intermediate goods moving up in technology. The supply chains of the 90s were moving away now from labor arbitrage to sort of greater reliance on digital platforms and knowledge workers. Technology shifts, for example, with 3D printing have an effect. Internet fragmentation and a breakdown in global governance. And here I want to thank Commissioner Hogan for taking part. I'm sure he's very busy. It's wonderful. I know he's made a lot of efforts on this front. I think the second change is that traditionally the US, often with the EU, played a major role in trying to shape the rules of the system, in part because the US had a cutting edge economy and it made sense for trying to establish rules and standards, whether it be for services or intellectual property or data or technology. President Trump has reversed that. He declared himself a protectionist in the inauguration, and I caution people they ought to believe him. For those that doubted, once he declared himself a tariff man, I think that sort of helped affirm it. He's transactional. He prefers uncertainty in the system as part of his deal making, so that cuts against the effort to have systemic rules. He focuses on bilateral trade deficits, and this won't change because this is a core part of his political essence with his base, like the wall. And then with the pandemic, I think there's a new set of challenges which Commissioner Hogan's kind of well aware of. One was raised by one of his former colleagues, Pascal Lamy, or his predecessor as a commissioner, talking about precautionary regulation. I think it's natural now that we're going to see more focus on health and safety standards, border controls. Inevitably, some will try to use this for protectionist purposes. There'll be more investment screening. There's going to be big increases in state subsidies and along with that, government requirements in terms of jobs and location. There's the U.S.-China decoupling, which I think will be strongest in the technology area. And the real question there is, it's already happened in telecommunications and internet, and whether it'll extend to all areas where you have data, including environmental topics or life sciences. We'll see limits on visas and movement of people. That will have an effect. One that the EU will be deeply involved with is conflicts over the changing taxation system, digital taxes as opposed to the traditional taxation based on locations. There'll be issues of carbon border taxes, which is another part of the EC agenda, and if Biden's elected, will be there. So I think the basic change that the system is going to have to deal with is whether it will adapt or whether it'll move to autarky. And right now, I think the US is not playing a constructive role. And the question in part will be whether the European Union and some of the other middle economies can take on the role of developing rules. So for example, the EU stepped in, I think, quite constructively to try to create at least a jury-rigged alternative to the dispute settlement system for the WTO. Japan and other economies kept the TPP alive in the process. And the one other aspect I draw attention to is the private sector, because I think as the governments flail in this area, you'll see more efforts of private sector to establish standards or arrangements. And just one anecdote to drive that home, about a month or two ago, I was part of something with the individual who developed the wireless internet protocols. And he said, as he developed these, he was sort of curious, whether governments would stand in, and it basically just got adopted. So we now all can participate with sort of wireless internet. So I think my prognosis is certainly challenging, maybe a little bit on the gloomy side, but this ultimately depends on the leading economies, both the government and the private sector.
Thank you. A lot to work with there. I wanted to ask Commissioner Hogan, I want to look at the institutions that we have globally to sort of guide us when it comes to trade. And so I wanted to ask Commissioner Hogan, do we have the right institutions for trade? Are things like the G7 and the G20 relevant? How's the WTO standing up or holding up through this?
Well, I think that we certainly need to have people working together, not working against each other. And that's why I suppose the European Union, as the perfect example of multilateralism, 27 member states, used to be 28, are working together in order to solve problems. And we've demonstrated that we can solve problems by working together in recent times with the major financial package that we agreed in relation to the COVID-19 problems that we have in the European Union. So that's a good example of where people working together can help in any way to try and solve some immediate problems. And of course, you're right, the WTO, as I mentioned earlier, is in crisis. It is the best organization available in the multilateral sense that can help us to overcome some of the difficulties, but it needs reform. And I share a lot of the analysis that has been mentioned by the United States, in recent times about some of those problems. But the United States don't always actually recognize that the European Union might be closer to it than it actually is in relation to reform of the WTO and making it more effective and efficient. The rules have to be adapted to the 21st century. It has to adapt itself to the new digital reality. It has to adapt itself to China and the huge growth of China since it became a member in 2001. So these are all the new realities that are there. And we also have to take account from a European perspective. We have to take account of the international agreements that we're signing up to and how the WTO can be an integral part of the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate agreement, as well as the need to lift restrictions and have overall institutional sense in relation to what we can do together. And therefore, the agenda that's ongoing in the WTO work at the moment on e-commerce, on trade facilitation, on fisheries, on domestic services regulations, they're all very important in terms of demonstrating that a global solution. There's a global solution required by countries working together. Now, the G7 and the G20 are, in my view, add-ons to that. They're another opportunity internationally where, on particular agenda items, that countries can work together in a more tighter group than 164 members in the WTO. And that's part of the problem, I suppose, with the WTO. How do you get consensus with 164 members? So we have to find a mechanism around this where we bring people on board in a plurilateral sense, I think, more and more in order to get as many countries on board as possible that have the skin in the game in relation to the particular sectors involved and work together to try and reduce costs, because I don't subscribe to the notion that increasing tariffs is actually good for anybody, because ultimately I believe the United States president is adding costs to business and adding costs to consumers, and he doesn't take account in his balance of payments deficits about the role of intermediate goods and a lot of the jobs that are being created in the United States from the intermediate treatment of those goods that are imported into the United States. So we have a difference of opinion on these issues, which are well known, but I'm sure that won't change President Trump's attitude towards those issues at the moment anyway.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up, if you had a magic wand and could do one thing to reform the WTO, what would be the urgent thing that you could magically fix about it so that it would be more effective?
Well, there's two things I would say. I think that the first thing I would say is that we have to find a way where you don't have to have consensus of 164 members for every decision you want to take. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have paralysis. And secondly, I think that countries that treat themselves with development status need to forego this particular status if they're some of the more progressive and important countries in terms of economics that there is. So those are the two main areas I think would be game changers.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And Bob, the U.S. trade rep Lighthizer has said that the WTO is working against U.S. interests. Is that right? Do you believe? No. Do you believe him?
Look, as I explained, you have a protectionist administration, and Bob has always been a protectionist, and he represented steel companies and aluminum companies to that effect. But so the WTO, which the United States very much helped create, was based on the GATT system, and together they led decades of incredible growth and development that helped the United States as well as others in the world. It established a basis of rules, as I explained, that often benefited U.S. companies. If you're a U.S. exporter, including the farmers that I would think Mr. Lighthizer is interested in, they certainly benefit from that. People benefit from intellectual property. On the dispute settlement topic, the United States wins most of the cases that it brings. It has cases brought against it. But I think that to be practical, Meg, what you have to come back to is the WTO really has two pieces. It's got the rulemaking part and it's got the dispute settlement part. And I think much of Bob Lighthizer complaints go against the dispute settlement because he'd prefer the old GATT model where countries could block opinions and thereby sort of use their own sort of individual leverage. And I think what you're seeing in the system is that if you can't continue to develop rules, then the dispute settlement system eventually runs aground. I mean, keep in mind that it was the Obama administration that first started to block appointments to the appellate body. And this reflected the frustration that certain US industries had, primarily with decisions on what are called anti-dumping and countervailing duty issues. So these are the efforts that countries make under their supposed sort of unfair trade laws. And my sense is that to get the WTO moving forward, you have to focus on both moving forward a rules agenda, but also the dispute settlement. And there's no one element on this. I think Commissioner Hogan started out with the key one. You know, the GATT started out with, I think, about 22, 23 members. If it's on to 164 now, it's very hard to get a total consensus on that. So you need some process by which you can have a liberalizing coalition move forward while still preserving the principle of most favored nation for the basic commitments that have been made in tariffs and others. I think you're also going to need some safety valves. This goes to the anti-dumping countervailing duty issue. When I was trade representative, I tried to use safeguards as an alternative to this because I thought the anti-dumping countervailing duty rules were manipulated, but that wasn't well received, didn't really work. You're going to have a challenge, particularly with China, about the role of state-owned enterprises and state subsidies. And I know this is an area the European Commission has a lot of experience with in terms of state aid issues. As the commissioner mentioned, you have this unusual sort of process by which countries decide whether they are treated as developing countries and subject to special and differential treatment. This problem started to really come apart during my time because you had middle-income countries that were taking advantage of it, very competitive ones, quite different, say, than sub-Saharan Africa. I think you have an exchange rate issue, which is part of the old GATT processes linked to the IMF, but people like Fred Bergson have come up with sort of ideas of dealing with it. And then I also agree with Commissioner Hogan. I think this issue of the environment and more broadly carbon border tax will be a very knotty one with developing countries. But frankly, I think if you're going to get the US back in the system, you're probably going to have to address this. So at one point you mentioned multilateral institutions. I think it's useful to keep in mind the decisions are still controlled primarily by capitals and nation states. And these institutions, which they often criticize, have been created by them. So whether it's the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, they're the ones that want to keep some limits on it, often for respectable reasons. But so the real challenge here is whether countries can see enough in their self-interest to develop a collective system. And in the case of the WTO, I think one is going to have some adaptation to allow liberalizers to move forward while keeping the core system.
Great, thank you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit towards China specifically. And actually, I'm going to throw it first to you, Bob, and then to Commissioner Hogan. But for Bob, I want to ask you sort of briefly, where is this trade skirmish between the US and China going? And then also in addition to that, where should it be going? Should we continue to be confrontational with China or should we actually engage China? Where do you fall on that debate?
Well, it's interesting you use the word skirmish. So I think some people would think it's gone a little bit beyond a skirmish. Evan Feigenbaum here at Carnegie used a good term. I think the whole relationship's in free fall, and we're not quite sure where the bottom is. I'll start out with a somewhat contrarian view, just because I think it's important to get out there. Keep in mind that China is actually used to have a global current account surplus of about 10%. It's now down to 0, so that's expanding sort of domestic or demand for the world. It no longer manipulates its exchange rate. It has been the greatest contributor to global growth. Prior to the Trump administration, it was the fastest growing market for US exports for 15 years. And on the WTO obligations, the story is somewhat mixed. many people may not be aware, China actually made much deeper commitments than, say, India, Brazil, other developing economies. And when it comes time to their quantitative commitments, they pretty much kept them. The problem has been in some of the less clear areas, like enforcement of intellectual property or uses of regulations and standards. And my takeaway from this, Megan, is, there's no holidays from the work of diplomacy, whether trade or foreign policy. And just to sort of throw up your hands in frustration is not a very productive effort. And so I think the reality, and this is the life of trade negotiators, you have to focus on the particulars. Just raising tariffs, as the US has done, I don't think is going to get you where you want to go. And after 3.5 years or 3 years, the Trump administration basically came up with a managed trade purchase agreement, which is falling far short. The most recent numbers are they're about 50% on track for what they were supposed to do. And so the approach I would take would be to try to put together coalitions with the European Union, Japan, Australia, other countries. And also, by the way, reformers within China who traditionally have recognized how they can use the international system to drive change. And then you have to focus on the particulars. So take intellectual property rights. China has instituted intellectual property rights courts that actually allow foreigners to win a lot of cases, but the penalties aren't high enough. The forced technology transfer was clearly banned when they joined the WTO, but it was hard to get evidence for cases. So I would actually push to get rid of a lot of the joint ventures which feed these things. On issues of state capitalism, there have been efforts in the TPP and other agreements to try to create competitive neutrality, or you counter them, you offset them. With Belt and Road, when people aren't sure, is it a development venture, a geopolitical venture, push the Chinese to accept the notion of standards about transparency, anti-corruption, procurement. Xi has talked about a lot of these things. And the question is, will a coalition hold them to do it? I think, as I mentioned before, the toughest area is going to be the technology space. And that will be the one that I think we're going to see the most sort of confrontation going forward. So the bottom line on this, and we were talking about Pompeo's speech, it's easy to sort of say what you don't like. The nature of foreign affairs or trade affairs, however, is your results. What are you trying to accomplish? And I haven't been able to see that.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Hogan, you mentioned that the EU might be closer to the US than the US realizes on a lot of things. What are the implications of the US-China trade war, I'll call it, for the EU? And are there opportunities for transatlantic partnership? And what does that look like in your mind?
Well, I suppose the United States and the European Union were a little bit slow to the table in recognizing the challenge that China was going to make on both geographical jurisdictions. And now we're playing catch up. And in 2019, the European Union came to the conclusion in early 2019 that we had a systemic rival in China, and where we declared that. And that was a big step for the European Union, coming from where it was in the previous years, where there was a huge increase in market access and economic activity and investment activity on both sides. And it began to realize that for critical technologies and critical infrastructure, there was a lot going on in the member states of the European Union that perhaps met the eye. And there was a vulnerability creeping into the system. So we then had the issue of unfair trading practices, where we heavily subsidized Chinese companies directly and indirectly, even in our neighborhood. We're beaming into companies that, in an internal market of the European Union, which is probably one of the most open in the world. So this was a challenge. So that's why we had to beef up our trade defense instruments, like our foreign direct investment screening, like the United States did, export controls, international procurement in terms of demanding reciprocity for market access. But also we always felt that the United States would never do what it's trying to do on its own. And I think this is proving to be the point. And we started to work with the United States last year intensively on industrial subsidy statement with Japan and the United States and ourselves. And we agreed in January this year a trilateral statement on how we would tackle the industrial subsidies, ironically, through a very major involvement of the WTO, the very organization that the United States are reluctant to engage with us on reforming. So I think that we're losing an opportunity here together in doing a lot of things together that will actually meet the objectives of what the United States and belatedly the European Union now have come to realize is the challenge of China. So I often regularly ask Ambassador Lysa to know when are we going to work together on these things. So we can, on trade and technology and on the level playing field issues, we can do a lot together. In fact, the European Union is having a very intense negotiation with China at the moment on the issues that Bob has mentioned, like state-owned enterprises and how they're subsidized, how unfair trading practices and how we deal with them on the forced technology transfer. But we know we can't do it all on our own. We're not immune to that notion of of standing independently out there and expecting to get the results without the help of the United States and like-minded countries, where we have Western democracies, we have shared values, and we should be working more closely together on these. So the three main themes that we're working with China at the moment, and we'd like to enshrine them in the WTO ultimately, is on the area of industrial subsidies, on the area of market access, on the area of sustainable development, and on the level playing field of how we can compete with each other in terms of our businesses in a fair way. We're not against competition, but we want fair competition.
Yeah, thanks. And as a follow-up to that, actually, I'm gonna start bringing in questions from the audience, though I have 50,000 for you guys. So to remind everybody watching, you can email in questions, submit them over YouTube chat, or tweet them to @CarnegieEndow. But we have one question that relates to U.S. EU cooperation in trade, but specifically when it comes to digital trade, given the crisis that we're facing, the coronavirus crisis, and given that it might be crucial to have like-minded partners ensure that data can flow responsibly across borders. And so this is a question from Isabel, and I'm going to throw it to you, Commissioner Hogan. What do you think, what are the prospects for actually having cooperation in terms of the digital transformation?
Well, we're working together in two initiatives, and we're working constructively together, I'm happy to say, on the e-commerce negotiations in the WTO. And hopefully we'll have a consolidated text in a few months in the WTO that will set the scene for a global e-commerce agreement, which will deal with issues like data protection, data flows, the localization of data. Now we have a checkered history, of course, in recent times on some high-profile court cases that didn't go our way in terms of our cooperation, but that doesn't mean that we should stop. We should adjust to the court decisions and move on from there. Of course, we see GDPR, which we have in the European Union to protect personal privacy, is politically very important. But we can work outside of that very strong reality in working together on the digital trade and the data flow issues. And the second area I think that we should be working more closely together on is developing a structure between us to be able to take account of all of the various agenda items on the digital area that are present, but they revolve largely around standards. If the United States and the European Union do not create the standards, somebody else will do it for us, and then we're too late. So we have made several attempts to get the United States on board on this agenda, and we'll keep trying.
Thank you. Now, Bob, we've talked a lot about how the EU and the US could cooperate, partly on the basis of where we are now, but I'm going to ask you to take out your crystal ball and look towards November 3rd. Commissioner Hogan highlighted that we have an election in the US, and ask you, where you think this would go if we had a Biden administration, and also ask if you think a Biden administration should look towards joining TPP or maybe even TTIP.
So I think the Biden team is somewhat torn on this. They have protectionist constituencies. The Democratic Party in the Congress tended to be more protectionist historically. You can see in terms of their election maneuvering, they're taking some of those steps. I think the reality, Megan, is, speaking with a little bit of political history, is an incoming Biden administration is going to face a huge set of issues at home. It's going to have an ongoing pandemic. It's going to have the challenges of inclusive economic growth. It's going to have uncertainty about the freight healthcare system. It's got immigration issues. It's got climate change and energy issues. It's got racial issues. This is a staggering agenda. And in our political system, you can't do everything. I mean, if you go back, whether it's the Carter, Clinton, or Obama administration, even with Democratic Congresses, they faced the challenge of what priorities would they have. And they also then faced the challenge, if they overreached, they got clobbered in the next sort of midterm election. So the connection of this with the EU is I think the reality is while former Vice President Biden has strong international ties and he will want to be, quote, more multilateral, it's a little fuzzy on how he would do that. And so I think actually the natural approach would be to build on some of that domestic agenda. So with the pandemic response, with the environment and energy response, with immigration with Mexico and Central America and other areas, there's clearly going to be a cybersecurity response. That would be a natural way to develop a common agenda with your close allies in Europe and frankly in Asia and elsewhere. And a part of that, it leads to how you will together deal with some of the challenges that China proposes for the future of free societies. Now, there'll be some specific issues, and this is always the challenge in the trade agenda. There's some things that'll be right there. So I would hope that they would abandon the ridiculous use of the 232 national security sort of tariffs where we're slapping on our allies and partners. You've got the Airbus Boeing dispute. We'll see what the next ruling is and whether they're, right now, all the sort of aircraft producers are getting clobbered. We've talked about the digital tax, and as I said, there'll be the sort of carbon border tax. So the one other point I would hope that both the US and EU could keep in mind that we haven't raised in this discussion is that I think the world is just beginning to appreciate the degree to which this pandemic is going to really clobber developing countries. Some of their financial markets, as you know, were held up a little bit because of the big monetary policies. But you're starting to see now the effect that their debt problems, need for debt restructuring, other issues. And this is going to be a real issue for Europe. I mean, if sub-Saharan Africa or doesn't grow, well, they're going to send people here. So I think whether it's the coordinated pandemic response or whether it's some of the economic and development issues, there's a strategic perspective that I hope the new administration would take. But I want to caution against over expectations because there are going to be a lot of parts of Biden's party coalition that are not only fighting over policy, but they're fighting over the future of the Democratic Party because with his age, he's seen as a transitional figure.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Commissioner Hogan, what do you think about the U.S. joining TTIP? Is that, can that be reopened now?
No, I don't see that happening at all. I think we've been there, done that, and I don't see it being resurrected in any way, no matter what administrations in the United States. But I think there are facets of it and elements of it, of course, that we can work with. And this is what we've been trying to do with the Trump administration, with not too much success, as you can see so far, except some tariffs being imposed on us for various things. So I think that whatever administration is in power after the 3rd of November, I hope that we will see a situation where we'll have closer cooperation with the US and the EU, because we don't like being accused of being part of the national security problems of the United States as allies, certainly when it comes to trade matters. And our member states in the European Union they've been quite patient in relation to these matters in the last few years. So there is a big agenda, as Bob has said, and I think, again, I'll come back to the notion that this agenda is always going to be stronger if like-minded allies can work closely together, and we can structure our trade and technology, we can structure our energy policy better, we can structure a lot of the issues that have been mentioned as part of the agenda that Bob has mentioned, that we can work very effectively together in all the various international fora and bilaterally to achieve the outcomes. And I think one of the most immediate ones, albeit a difficult one, is how do we get greater outreach with the United States and Japan and ourselves on the industrial subsidies agenda, where we're seeing systematic unfairness and unfair trading practices. And we are working hard, but it's a difficult time to achieve much of that because we have ourselves have to throw some money at the companies in order to help them survive through this pandemic. And the pandemic issues and the fallout from the pandemic, regrettably, is going to travel on for a lot longer than people expected, or people maybe still expect. This is going to be 2023, 2024 by the time we see, coming, hopefully, be able to come through it, but it's going to take a couple of years.
Megan, could I just add one other thought, because it's a sort of intersection of these issues that people often don't comment on. But obviously we're dealing with the COVID-19. But I was on a call not long ago with a true virologist specialist, and he said, you know, there's about 5 of these a year that they watch that could expand, and about that they worry about for future pandemics. And he said about 3 of them are wildlife related. And so I think you're going to see more attention as we dig into what was the cause of COVID-19 to the dangers of wildlife trafficking. And wildlife trafficking becomes a trade issue. It becomes a law enforcement issue. And so this is a good example of where when people think about trade, they often focus about it purely in terms of textbook economic efficiency. I've always looked at trade as a foundation for cooperation on a series of these other issues. And so one of the risks that we run is that if the trade system further frays and we move towards geopolitical blocks or national autarkic sort of systems, you're going to pay a price with a series of other issues, whether it's dealing with terrorist finance or wildlife trafficking in pandemics. I'm not sure that's fully appreciated.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thank you. I've got a question about a carbon adjustment tax, which I think, Bob, you mentioned is something the EU is already looking at, but a Biden administration might be as well. And so I'm curious what you think about how strong that carbon adjustment tax would be. Would it be enough to actually shift imports? And then if so, do you have a sense of what kinds of imports it will be shifting? Will it just be, developing markets, imports of apparel from developing markets, or would it actually only be high energy, really obvious kind of carbon abusers like bauxite, steel, the airline industry, automobiles, that kind of thing? What do you think about that?
Is this for me or for the commissioner?
So I'll kick it to you first.
Okay, well, we should hear from Phil, because I think this has been, the EC has come forward with a sort of the idea of a proposal about this. My point is, all those specifics that you listed, which are very important, I think are still in the ether. In other words, the issue here is, it goes back to my prior point. People are now seeing the connection of the trade issue with the carbon issue. And before we get to those issues, there'll be a huge fight with developing countries that we'll see, just as 10 or 15 years ago, we talked about labor and basic environmental agreement standards. They'll see this as a form of protectionism. So I personally think that from the US perspective, it could be a way in which a Biden administration could play a more active role in the trade game if it can build in the concern for the carbon environmental issue. But frankly, the specific answer to your question is, I don't think people have gotten very far along the sort of what industries, how it would be done. It's the same sort of issues that you've encountered for the past 10 or 15 years with carbon taxes. But the commission has come forward with us, at least the idea that it specifically wants to include this. So probably Phil would know more.
Yeah, so let me kick that over to Commissioner Hogan and also ask about kind of taxology of this stuff and how you guys plan on addressing that, because the EU is a little bit further along in this debate than we are in the US.
I wish I could say that we were further along in this debate, and you probably, I'm going to assure you that we're not. This is at a stage of infancy where we have the idea, which was set out in our political guidelines for the next 5 years in the Commission by the President and adopted by the Council and the Parliament last year. But nobody really knows yet how it's going to work because we are at this impact assessment stage and we're consulting with stakeholders to know how we can do this and at the same time meeting our environmental and economic objectives can be sometimes difficult. And also I agree with Bob that we don't want this particular tax to be a protectionist measure. So it has to be WTO compatible. And to achieve that is a challenge. So you can take it that there's a lot of internalizing about this. At the recent European Council Summit, there was an agreement reached that we should proceed as soon as possible. We're putting a proposal on the table, and that would probably emerge next springtime. And how this will work in reality. And it can go either way. It can go in a broad range of economic areas, or it can go in the highly concentrated energy areas that you mentioned, including one that you didn't mention, cement. So all of these, industries who are energy intensive could become the focal point, or you could have a broad brush measure. But I feel that it will be difficult to implement properly unless you have a lot more countries involved in this, in addition to the European Union. So otherwise, you can be accused of being protectionist, but also it can lead to uncompetitiveness in some sectors in the European Union. So it's quite a balancing act, and Commissioner Gentiloni, who is Italian, is going to have certainly his work cut out for this proposal.
Yeah, so a lot of answers that we're still searching for on that.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Let me switch gears a little bit. I've got a question on technology, specifically Huawei and 5G. And it seems like the US and different European countries have adopted different strategies in response to Huawei in particular. Bob, do you think the world's in danger of splitting into two completely different technology platforms? And do you think we should go in that direction? How should we address this?
Well, what we've done on the European Union side is we published our data strategy in February, where we set out the criteria or the rules that we would like to see observed by our member states, but also it gives us the backdrop to how we would adjudicate on supporting a particular 5G company or the rollout of 5G. So we have Ericsson's and Nokia are there at the moment. Nokia is, of course, smaller than Ericsson's, but nevertheless, they're important players from the point of view of creating some competition, at least in albeit in a smaller way than we would like with Huawei. So, and we see developments in the United States and the strong line they're taking on the security issues and how influential they think that they have been with the United Kingdom in recent times in relation to the decision in terms of the Chinese network. So this again is becoming more of a political issue than actually an issue around the rollout of 5G. And we have tried in the Commission to make it an issue about the rollout of 5G. And indeed, of course, we're on the verge of going to be talking about in the near future of 6G developments. So again, this is an area that I feel strongly about, where standards are going to be important. And therefore, the United States and the European Union should be working in a structured way together around the areas of 5G, around the areas of artificial intelligence and all of these technological developments, and creating those standards and having the necessary regulatory cooperation between us that's going to make it easier for our business to adapt and at less cost.
Yeah.
So Megan, did you want me to add something on this, or did?
Yeah, I did. And specifically, if we do split into two different technology platforms, what are the geopolitical and economic implications of that? I'm curious to hear your views on that too.
Well, I think we're already splitting. And frankly, before the Huawei came in, if you were the US technology internet companies, you weren't going to be able to operate in China very effectively. So this has come from both sides. So I think there'll be lots of, to use your words, skirmishes as you go back into the telecommunications and internet world, but you're going to inevitably sort of move apart. The issue that I want to, that relates to this, that I think is going to be even more fundamental, is that most innovation across industries is now based on big data and data usage, as you know. And if the idea of national security as relates to internet or telecommunications extends to any use of data, then you're going to have a split across a whole series of other sectors. For example, life sciences, or as I mentioned, environmental development. So just take life sciences. Over the past 20 or 30 years, there's actually been a trans-Pacific generation of Chinese and Americans, Chinese coming to the United States, getting advanced degrees, doing research, joint venture companies. In the world of pandemics, this is something that could actually be quite of use to people. And given the big data resources in China, it could be quite important. But if in the debate we say any access to individualized information means that we won't permit that sort of interaction, you're going to lead to a split in that sector as well. So I think this will be the big political question, is that whether there's enough commonality on some of these topics or enough safeguards that can be built in, because data is really the future of innovation. Now, as the broader sort of geopolitical implications, this is, I think, on the verge of, we have to try to decide whether we want to try to keep a system that has some global resilience because of rules and standards with various protections, or whether to move to an autarkic system. And one of the ironies is things that you might do for national resilience can conflict with global resilience. And this is a political battle we've seen at sort of other times and places. And I think the U.S.-China relationship is going to be fundamental to this. But again, as the commissioner and I have both mentioned, I think the United States would be much wiser if it approached this in cooperation with the EU and Japan and other countries, and also tried to get the Chinese to recognize the commonality of interests on some of these topics.
Thank you. Commissioner Hogan, I've got a question on Airbus Boeing, which for a lot of people kind of represents the skirmishes between the US and the EU. So I'm just curious what you see the choreography in that dispute being, and whether you think there will be settlement this year.
Well, I think if people negotiate rather than continue to litigate, we might get a solution. And this is going on for 16 years. It's actually a perfectly good example of the problems of the WTO, that this is going on for so long. And it's costing a fortune to the companies. And in the context of the pandemic now, Boeing and Airbus are the two companies that are suffering the most. I think that it's another example of where the aircraft and civil aircraft business, again, that we're going to face challenges from other parts of the world if we don't get our act together between the United States and the European Union. So the present state of play is that Boeing, according to Ambassador Lighthizer, have declared unilateral compliance to the WTO in respect to the measures that they have taken. Of course, we don't necessarily agree with that on the European Union side, but equally, we have made moves in the European Union side last week to amend certain contracts in relation to the way they're subsidized in the 4 member states of the European Union: Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and Spain. And this has been a major effort, but also I think a major breakthrough in terms of trying to resolve this issue, if the United States sees this in the spirit and in the way that I see it. I think the companies now have an opportunity in this crisis, in this health crisis, to face up to the reality and responsibilities on both sides. And the United States and the European Union can negotiate an outcome for this, to decide once and for all the level playing field that we want to trade together with, and resolve issues for the future in particular, about how we want to actually have these very important companies part and parcel of our economies. So I can go into a lot of technical details, which I don't think your listeners would appreciate, because it's been going on for 16 years. I'm not going to bore them with it. But all I will say is that we have made progress in 2020, probably more progress than we did in the previous 15 years. And I think we should sit down and talk in the next couple of months. Otherwise, we're going to be putting tariffs on each other for the rest of this year.
Thanks. And sort of off the back of that final comment you just made, because both of you are sort of arguing for sitting down and talking and having a more multilateral approach.
Not really. Only one side.
I meant the US and the EU broadly seems that, generally a better approach rather than just taking a unilateral response is taking a more transatlantic response to some degree. But I have a question for Bob, which is, how practical is that really? I mean, once the US has imposed tariffs, how can we back out of that without looking really weak? Is that realistic? Is there a route out of where we've gotten to?
Well, 2 dimensions. First, a bit of history that explains it. I'm the U.S. Trade Representative that brought this suit, so I have a perspective on this, which is that this had been a long-standing problem. That, as I discussed with Boeing, if you recall, 15, 20 years ago, there was a strategic decision, and Boeing believed in the future of point-to-point air travel, which they were developing the 787, and at that time, Airbus's strategy was hubs. So they had this huge 380. And the concern at that time that Boeing had is they said, look, we're willing to rely on our strategy, But as our strategy is successful, we don't want launch aid for what we know will be the competing sort of Boeing plane, which is indeed sort of what happened. And so there's a point where one has to say, well, what's the purpose of these? So I've watched, I don't know the details, but I've seen the EU sort of change some of the launch aid policies. It looked to me like they were addressing a lot of the issues that the US and Boeing was originally complaining about. And so you now have to look at the economic context for air travel today and ask yourself whether this is going to be constructive for Boeing or Airbus. So coming back to your point and your question is that of course you can reach a solution. And you know, in some ways the posturing is easy to do. People can always say, I'm protecting this interest, that interest. The guts in these jobs comes from trying to find sort of win-win possibilities. And this is going to be a theme that really cuts across this conversation, including you asked about the Biden administration. You know, it'll depend a lot on who are sort of the key trade appointees, whether they decide just to tread water with the politics or whether they try to find some innovative approaches on some of these topics that's a little bit different and sort of build different political coalitions in sort of a different fashion. So going back to your original point, I was sort of surprised when you talked about the free trade consensus. This is always heavy lifting. I mean, now, just to give you one more sort of particular example, in 1947, when the United States was seen as dominant in the world economy, and it was trying to launch the creation of the GATT, the 22 or 23 economies, the American negotiator, Will Clayton, had to return and make a personal case argument to Truman because the Congress had passed a wool tariff of 50% that would have had the Australians pull out, that would have pulled the British out. The Europeans said, well, if Britain wasn't in, and Truman gave 15 minutes each to Clayton and the Secretary of Agriculture. The Secretary of Agriculture in 1947 said, you'll lose up to 7 states in the 48 election if you veto this tariff. Truman vetoed the tariff, actually authorized the cut, and the GATT was created. So this image that you know, trade had some halcyon days where these political fights were always, you know, not present is just false. And what I think we've been trying to discuss on this conversation is where can you find the fissures and opening, whether in development, environment, some of the digital areas, to find some common ground. And the last point on the negotiations is, you know, Henry Kissinger had this wonderful term about fantasy negotiations. When you negotiate, you got to give and take. One side doesn't walk away with everything.
Yeah. Yeah, no thanks. And that's a good commentary, not just in terms of Airbus Boeing, in terms of getting back out of where we are, but path dependency in trade broadly doesn't necessarily have to determine outcomes. So I've got one more question for Commissioner Hogan.
I suppose, Megan, that one of the issues I'd say on this is,
sure.
If the mindset on this issue is to negotiate rather than litigate, I think we would solve it. But you can remind, I think Bob would agree with me that you have people with the file in their hands for 16 years, they find it hard to let go.
Yeah, fair enough. I've got one more question for you, Commissioner Hogan, and it's on China joining the agreement on government procurement. So you've talked about how a lot of this is about, you know, establishing norms. And I think this gets at the heart of it. Do you think that we should be trying to encourage China to join the agreement on government procurement and take other measurements to reorient the economy, or do you think that's futile? Is that an approach you would recommend?
Well, what we really need, I suppose, at the end of the day is to be able to have fair and free competition and the definition of a level playing field. And hopefully we could enshrine that in a WTO context. And that's why we agree with the United States that the negotiating function and the rules that need to be adapted for 21st century trade, like any organization after 25 years, you have to look at yourself and see how you're doing. But as the number of members of the WTO has grown, it creates, you know, bigger problems in terms of getting effective and efficient decision making. Therefore, something has to give. And what we have at the moment is paralysis. And we've had very few, if we call the WTO the global referee, well, we've had very few scores on the board since 2015. It was the last time we got something on technology and on export subsidies. And before that, not a whole lot. So in the 25 years, if anybody objectively was looking back on it, even though we said it was a great idea from the word go, certainly we need to look at how we can actually get more effective and efficient decision making. And if people then can self-declare, that they are going to be enjoying a particular status, that doesn't help either. So in respect of moving forward in the future, I think that the United States and Japan and the European Union have a good statement that we can work on and build from there on that agenda and go to China. And I think that that's the way you bring China in from the fold. They will be very conscious, in my view, of not having a difficult economic and trading relationship with more than one entity at a time. And that's why I think that they'll be very conscious of the difficult situation politically and economically they're facing with the United States. So the European Union may have a little bit of leverage maybe to work, and maybe other entities in the world might have a little bit of leverage on China at this point in time. That window will not always be there in order to achieve certain policy objectives, in order to create that level playing field that we want. And it includes all of the items, including the GPA.
Great, thanks. Listen, we're running out of time, and so I just want to invite each of you actually to provide some concluding remarks and quick 30-second conclusion. I'm going to ask Bob to provide them first.
Well, I thank you, Megan, for hosting this, and again, particularly Commissioner Hogan, who's got a full-time job and has to deal with all these issues. And I think as he closed, and also with his references, Boeing is critically important. There's this fine line between a political and economic leadership. I'll call it political economy. And trade is a tricky topic because you got to know the technical aspects and people can get lost in them. But you have to rise above it and try, as we've said today, to try to see some of the interconnections and the larger stakes. And my one just suggestion for the commissioner and his friends in the EU and Europe and other allies is that if we do have a sort of transition here, as I suggested, there's going to be a very full plate for a new administration. But I think if they're approached with some ideas about sort of win-win possibilities, you'll have a better chance for success. So, at the end of the day, never underestimate the fact that if somebody brings a good idea to somebody that can make everybody look good, that's the best way to proceed.
Well, I suppose the best form of diplomacy is to make sure that the other person at the other side of the table makes your suggestion for you. So that's the ultimate good outcome you have in a trade negotiation if it becomes the other person's idea. But certainly I very much value this opportunity by Carnegie to engage with Bob. I know of you, and I've read some of your articles over the last number of years, and you're a very well-informed commentator on these matters. So we value the interaction for the benefit of our stakeholders and our listeners. You're quite correct that this is a very difficult job at the moment in the European Union Trade Commission role, where you have the relationship with the United States, which, as somebody that's born on the 4th of July, I would have preferred to be going much better. Secondly, we have the Brexit negotiations going on at the moment, which is taking up a bit of time. And we have our Chinese negotiations. And of course, we have the WTO reform agenda. So, and you've mentioned a very important strategic interest to it as well, of course, is Africa. And I just want to say to you as well that I share very much what you said about broadening the trade agenda to include chapters that would be maybe the non-traditional market access business chapters. And this is what we're doing in the European Union. We will not get approval for a mandate for a trade negotiation now with a third country. Our approval of the outcome, if we don't have 14 or 15 chapters rather than the one or two usual suspects on market access or tariffs or business environment. So it does include all of the issues that you speak about in terms of the welfare of people and the continents around trade and sustainable development, around research and innovation, around gender equality. All of these issues now are more and more important from a political point of view, and the role of trade and politics has grown a lot, even since your time, in terms of the broad horizon that now it must address in order to get a political acceptance. And of course, we'll never probably get an end to the conversation about the value of globalization and trade. So that's always going to be with us. But I think that just to reassure people that and I very much share this agenda, that trade is one aspect of how it can contribute to the economy, but equally it has a very important role to play in terms of societal concerns.
Great, thank you. I want to also, extend my thanks to the Carnegie Endowment for hosting this really interesting discussion. And I want to thank both Bob Zoellick and also Commissioner Hogan for taking the time to have this conversation. And I want to wish Commissioner Hogan all the best with what he rightly identifies as a really full plate. So thanks to our listeners also for dialing in. Really appreciate it.
Good luck, Commissioner.
Thank you, Juan.